All right, so this first section for Unit 2 is on the Articles of Confederation. Now, the Articles of Confederation are the first form of government in our new country. After we signed the Treaty of Paris of 1783, we are officially recognized by the world as the United States of America, and we have to figure out how to govern ourselves. Now, since 1776, we have effectively been governing ourselves as an independent nation, and we set up the Articles of Confederation. This is not the current form of government. This is a very short-term version of government that we have for about the first 10 years that we exist. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, the Articles of Confederation are not the only type of government in the Americas or in the United States during this time period. We also have state constitutions. So every state, New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, you name it, they are setting up their own governments with state constitutions. A constitution is just the governing document. Think of it as the manual or the handbook for your governments. And they're going to set up constitutions for the purposes of upholding freedom, liberty, democracy, those natural rights that we talked about with John Locke and then later with our Declaration of Independence. For example, Virginia is going to create something called the Bill of Rights. Now, the Bill of Rights in Virginia is based off of the earlier English Bill of Rights. These are rights or freedoms that are protected by the government, that the government agrees that you have and will continue to have. These are things like trial by jury. If you commit a crime, a jury of peers, typically people that live in the area, will decide whether you are guilty or not guilty. Also, things like freedom of religion. You have the ability to practice whatever religion you want, or freedom of the press. If you remember from when we talked about the John Peter Zenger trial, that is the freedom to print or type or write whatever you'd like, as long as it's true. The government cannot crack down on you for being rude or mean or critiquing members of the government or the government itself. Now, within these state constitutions, we're seeing states typically split power between an executive and a legislature, meaning there is an executive, one main leader, think the president, and then a legislature, the people who actually legislate or create the laws, think Congress. Voting during this time period, it's still heavily restrictive. Now, before the United States of America became a thing, when we were still colonies of Great Britain, the only men or the only people who could vote were white men over 21 who owned property and were Christian. We've dropped the religion requirement here. Now you just have to be a white dude over 21 years old who either owned property or paid taxes. And typically you only paid taxes if you own property. So this is still sort of a wealth requirements as well, not just your gender, your race, and your age requirements. A quick knowledge check. What freedoms do many states agree to protect? Now here's where we get into the Articles of Confederation. Now up to this point, we have our state constitutions, right? They've existed since we were colonies, but we don't really have an overall governing body. We tried to with the Continental Congress, and that went fine, not great. We tried to with the Albany Plan of Union during the 7 Years' War / French and Indian War. That one failed. So we don't have a super great track record of setting up a constitution or a central government that is effective and strong. Now, the biggest hurdle that we're going to talk about during this section, and the reason that the Articles of Confederation do not exist today, is that they're a little bit too weak. And now you're probably thinking, okay, why would we create a weak government? That seems kind of dumb. And on one hand, you're right, setting up a weak government is kind of dumb because you can take advantage of it really easily. But on the other hand, the government as a whole isn't weak. Specifically, the national government is weak, and it's weak on purpose because we want the states, at least in this time period, to keep most of the power. So the states are powerful. There is a powerful government, but it is the state government, not the national government. So for example, the California state government would be super powerful, but the United States government would not. That doesn't mean you and me can just break the laws willy-nilly, but it does mean that the state is mostly in charge of things. So by 1777, about 1 year after we declare independence officially with the Declaration of Independence, we approve the first Constitution, which creates something called the Articles of Confederation, or which consists of the Articles of Confederation. we create a loose alliance, or a confederation, if you will, hence the name, of these 13 independent states. So we are one country, the United States of America, but we are United States. We are not one we are not one single entity, one single thing. We are a collection of 13 things, 13 states. Now, 4 years after this, near the end of the American Revolution, right around the time of the Battle of Yorktown, states are going to cede their western land claims to Congress, and the Articles of Confederation are officially ratified by the states. So between 1775-ish, when the war starts, and 1781, the Articles of Confederation don't necessarily exist yet. What we have is we have the First and Second Continental Congresses. We have some sort of grouping of states working together to make things work in our new government. But this whole idea of a national government, the Articles of Confederation tying the states together, doesn't necessarily exist until the last couple years of the war, 1781. So let's talk about some strengths. Let's talk about the good things of the Articles of Confederation. So the first good thing is states are free to make decisions for themselves. This is good. For the last, 100 plus years, we've been told what to do by the King and Great Britain, and we're tired of this. We want to make the decisions on our own. We want to have a say in how we're governed. It's like half the reason we declare independence. So that's a good thing. We like this. Now, this is kind of hand in hand with the previous one. The federal government is not super powerful. That's on purpose, because the last time we had a powerful federal government, the king and parliaments, they took advantage of us, and we don't want to see that happen again. Also, every state has one vote, regardless of size. So giant Virginia can't bully tiny Maryland, tiny Delaware can't get bullied by giant Pennsylvania, etc., because every state has equal power. This makes sure that one state does not become more powerful than the others. Additionally, Congress, under the Articles, is given the power to declare war, appoint military officers, so like choose generals and stuff, coin money, meaning create currency, create the US dollar, for example. They operate post offices for communication. They conduct foreign affairs, meaning they interact with other countries, and they're able to sign treaties. Now, these are the strengths of the Articles. There's unfortunately many more weaknesses, and that's really why these Articles are going to fail. Weakness number one, there's not very much power in the federal government. Now, this is on purpose. Like, we knew this was going to be a weakness, and we were okay with it, but it ends up becoming a bigger deal than we expect it to be. So the Articles of Confederation really can't do much. In addition, whenever we want a brand new law, like literally any new law, 9 states have to say, yeah, that sounds good. That makes sense. So anytime a law needs to get passed, this isn't like today where Congress can vote on it with representatives that we, people in states have elected. Instead, every single state legislature has to look at the law, vote on the law, and then 9 out of 13 states have to agree. Now, I don't know if you follow politics today, but you'll notice that a lot of states really don't agree on things. California, for example, doesn't really agree on a lot of the same things as Texas or Florida. A state like New York might have very different views or beliefs than a state like Wyoming. A state like Michigan might have a very different lifestyle than a state like Oklahoma. Getting a lot of them on the same page is very, very difficult. So, on one hand, totally makes sense. You want to have most states in agreement. But on the other hand, getting a bunch of different people in different states to agree on something is going to be very difficult. In addition, state governments are in charge of enforcing the laws. Now, on one hand, totally makes sense. It's within the state, they should be in charge. The problem is when not everyone agrees. Now, let's say 9 states agree to ban slavery because slavery is evil. Okay, sounds great. Here's the problem. If Virginia, for example, does not want to ban slavery, and they're not one of those 9 states, they are still in charge of enforcing the law. So they could decide, hey, that law sucks. That law is super dumb. I'm going to ignore it, and I am not going to enforce it. You see a situation where a law like outlawing slavery would absolutely get enforced in a place like Massachusetts, where they hate slavery. But it would not get enforced in a place like Virginia, where the economy and the people and the society revolves around slave labor. So you see a situation where laws are not evenly applied as a result of the Articles. In addition, there's no president, there's no central leader, there's no person we could look to in a crisis. Now, on one hand, this is good, right? Because you don't want one person becoming too powerful. You don't want one person to become a king. The downside is when there's a crisis, when there's a horrible situation and we need quick, decisive action, there's no one to look to. Whenever something terrible happens, think Pearl Harbor or 9/11, or in the future, let's say we get invaded by someone again, we want someone to look to who can make a decision. If we have like 15, 25, 30 people in a room trying to come to an agreement, that's going to take a while. But if everything at the end of the day lands on the shoulders of one person, like they might in a crisis, or like it might during wartime, it makes sense to have one person who can make a quick, decisive decision, even if it's not the perfect decision, even if it's not a great decision. A decision or action in general will usually be better than nothing at all, especially in a crisis. And we can even make more informed decisions later to tweak, counteract, make it better. So this is a downside here. There's no quick response to anything because we got to get everyone on the same page first. Additionally, Congress does not have the power to regulate trade or have the power to tax, meaning if the government needs money, well, they have to ask nicely. And I don't know about you guys, but if somebody asks to borrow money from you, you're probably not going to be super down to do that unless you really like them and you really trust them. Imagine if the state of California, like they sent some people and they knocked on your door and they said, hey, please, can you give us some money so we can run the government? You're probably going to say no. You don't know those people. You don't have a personal connection to them. Sure, on one hand, yes, it makes sense we want the government to have money. But if you have the option of just not giving the government money, you're probably going to take that option. Because think about it. If Virginia doesn't pay its taxes, but then like New York gives money and Pennsylvania gives money and Georgia gives money, then that thing is going to get done whether or not Virginia pays. So Virginia can get all the benefits of taxes without actually having to pay for them. And every single state's going to do this math. Every single state's going to realize I could not pay and someone else might pay for it instead, and then I still get the benefits. That sounds like a pretty good deal, right? They're essentially getting stuff for free. The problem is everyone's going to think this way, so nobody's going to pay their taxes, and the government's going to be broke. Additionally, the government cannot regulate trade. Now, one of the big ways we're going to make money during this time period is tariffs. Tariffs are basically a tax on goods that come from other countries. If the government cannot regulate trade, the government cannot impose tariffs, which means the government cannot make money. So for a lot of the Articles of Confederation's existence, we're going to have basically no money as a country. Speaking about no money, no state can be forced to pay money to the federal government. So that whole thing about, hey, I don't have to pay my taxes because I don't want to, that's exactly what states like Virginia, New York, and Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts are going to do. They have no reason to pay, they're not forced to pay, so they're good to go. Also, speaking of not having to pay money, they also don't have to provide soldiers for the governments. The government doesn't have an army. Like the Confederation, the Articles of Confederation do not create an army. Everything's still state militias. Everything's still Minutemen. The only time they can create a national army is if they ask the states politely, and the states give those soldiers to the government. But remember, we just fought a war to get away from a government that had soldiers that we could not control. So clearly, states are not going to send soldiers because they will not be able to control them. Additionally, there's no court system. There's no central court system. Now, Virginia has its state courts. Maryland has its state courts. And they can solve things between, they can solve issues between two Virginians or two Marylanders. But the problem is, what if Virginia and Maryland have an issue? Well, are they going to go to Virginia's court? No, of course not. That's not fair to Maryland. Are they going to go to Maryland's court? No, that's not fair to Virginia. Can they go to New York's court? Well, what if New York is going to side with one over the other? There's no system in which you have an overarching court system in which you can solve these issues. So whenever two states have a problem with each other, there's kind of no solution. There's no way to go about solving that problem. And that leads us to our next knowledge tech. What are the functions of Congress under the Articles of Confederation? What can Congress actually do? So that was the strengths and weaknesses. Now let's talk about what it looks like in practice. We've talked conceptually like, hey, some of this stuff might not be so great. Let's talk about what it actually looks like in real life. And the first thing we're going to deal with is a bunch of different states having disagreements. As you can see on this map is a mess. Every single state has different claims. So, for example, Virginia is going to claim what is modern-day Kentucky. North Carolina is going to claim what is modern-day Tennessee. A lot of these states, when they were first founded, one of the things you have to do when you create a state, when you found a state, is you have to talk about your borders, right? You have to know what is your state and what is not your state. And the problem is, when we first got this country, when we first got to this land, we were super vague and not clear about where those boundaries were. Now, obviously, if you are, let's use Virginia, for example. If you're Virginia, it's pretty clear where your eastern border is, right? It's the ocean. No one's living in the sea, right? There's no mermaids living in Virginia. But what about your western border? There's mountains. There's the Appalachian Mountains. And then past that, we don't know. Not very many people have been out there. We know there is a Mississippi River around there somewhere, and there's stuff even past that, but we're not entirely sure where that is. So when Virginia is first formed as the Jamestown colony in 1607, they kind of just say, oh, it just goes west as far as the continent goes. So if those claims had stayed today, Virginia would also own some of Northern California because they would have gone all the way to the West Coast. And every state's going to say this. Pennsylvania's going to say this. New York's going to say this. North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, you name it. They're all going to claim that their border goes basically as far as the eye can see. And that's a problem because if you look at this map, Virginia and Maryland kind of overlap a little bit. Or New York and Pennsylvania, they kind of overlap a little bit. Maryland can't claim to the coast because Georgia's claims are going to overlap as well. Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, they're kind of smushed together where their borders meet. That's going to complicate things too. So we have a bunch of different borders and a bunch of different claims. And like we talked about on the last slide and before, there's no court system to kind of figure this stuff out. So the problem becomes we can't figure out who owns what. Now, eventually, as the articles are ratified, they do give all that empty land, all that land on this map that isn't modern day state borders, they do give that to just the federal government as a whole. So luckily we solved the issue here. But this issue being an issue in the first place shows that there is something deeply wrong with the Articles of Confederation. There's no easy way to solve problems when problems arise. This one's solved, but that doesn't mean every problem is going to be solvable easily, quickly, painlessly, or peacefully. Now let's talk about money. Now, if you remember from the weaknesses of the articles, there's no way to tax the states. There's no way to get money from the states. Basically, they got to ask very nicely, and hopefully the states are feeling like paying for things. But if you don't have to pay, you're most likely not going to pay. So when we end this war, we are millions of dollars in debt. Now, who are we in debt to? We're in debt to two people, roughly speaking. Person number one is France. We owe a lot of money to France. France did not just lend us their navy, lend us their soldiers, lend us their supplies. We had to pay for them. They loaned us things. They said, hey, we'll help you out. Hey, we'll send you food if you pay us back in the future, right? They gave us a loan. The other group that we owe money to are American citizens. These are called government bonds. Now, we'll talk about government bonds in more detail later, but the quick version is if the government needs money, it's going to ask for a loan from the people. And the way they get that loan is they issue bonds. Now, for example, when I was born, my parents took out a couple of bonds in my name. And those bonds would take 25 years to mature, meaning they would have paid $50 or something back when I was born in 1998. And then 25 years later, 2023, those bonds would get sent back to me with basically with a check. And it would say, hey, here's how much you can cash it for. So that $50 bond, because it took 25 years to mature, that might end up being $100 or $200. It really depends on the time period of the bond, how much money you take out, and what the economy looks like when you are taking that bond out. And the nice thing about government bonds, it's a guaranteed profit. You will always make more money back because you are loaning it to the government. Now, this is the easiest way for the government to make money. They can issue new bonds. They can say, hey, I want $100 from Mr. Hour, and then in 20 years or so, I will give him back $110 or $200 or insert whatever dollar amounts you want. It really depends on the bond. And this is what we're going to do. We owe a lot of money to individual people. We also owe a lot of money to France, like I mentioned. We owe some money to Spain as well, the Netherlands, some other countries that help us out. But it's mostly France, and it's mostly our own people. Now, this is not a problem as long as we can pay that money back. But like we just talked about, there's no easy way to do this because there's no way to raise money through taxes. We cannot make the states pay. We have to ask them to pay. And of course, like we had already talked about, states are not really going to want to pay our money. Now, Virginia will pay Virginia's debts, but Virginia is not going to pay America's debts. New York is not going to pay America's debts. They will pay their own state debts. To make matters worse, continental dollars, which you can see a picture of up here, they're basically worthless. Now, a currency's worth or a currency's value really depends on how strong the government is, the amount of debt that government is in, and how long that government's been about. It's all about trust. So like, for example, when you go to the store, you trust that that dollar bill in your pocket is worth $1. And Pavilions or Ralph's or the dollar store or whatever, they trust that that $1 bill is worth $1. And the reason we trust that is because the United States is a very powerful country. The United States is a very strong government. It has a very strong economy and has a very strong military. The government's not going anywhere anytime soon. And the government has guaranteed that that dollar will be worth something. We all trust the government. We all trust the government's ability to keep our economy afloat for the most part. And because of that, that dollar has value. But when you're a brand new country, and when you owe a lot of money to people and you have no clear way to pay it off, people aren't really going to trust that. And because they don't trust that, these continental dollars are going to be pretty worthless. They're still worth something, they're just not worth a lot of something. And because of this, a lot of these states are going to actually make their own money. So there's going to be Virginia dollars, there's going to be Delaware dollars, there's going to be North and South Carolina dollars. And that's going to create a couple issues. Issue number one is there's just 13 different kinds of currency, actually 14 if you count continental dollars. That's going to make trade between states very difficult. If you live in New York and you want to sell something to someone in Virginia, they're going to pay you in Virginia dollars. But you live in New York. You use New York dollars. How is that going to work? What's the exchange rate look like? This becomes very complicated very quickly. Now, we do deal with this today, but this is between different nations, right? We deal with, there's pesos in Mexico, there's yen in Japan, there's kroner in Denmark, there's pounds in Great Britain. Across the EU, which is most nations in Europe are part of the EU, they use the euro, for example. These are all different types of currencies that we exchange. But within those countries, it's all the same money, right? We all use the US dollar today. We don't use the California dollar. We don't use the Nevada dollar, etc. And the reason we all use the same money is because it's easy. We want trade inside our own country to be easy. We don't want to make it complicated. If it's complicated, it won't happen, or it will happen less. So what happens is New Yorkers really aren't venturing outside of New York to trade as often as they could have if it was all continental dollars. Virginians are really mostly going to trade in Virginia. They'll go outside of the state when it makes sense to, but for the most part, it's going to become more difficult and more expensive because of the whole exchange process. So they're not going to worry about it or bother doing it in a lot of cases. And because of this, our economy is going to suffer even more. So a lot of money issues, essentially. That's the trend here. The government's not strong and stable, so the money is not strong and stable, so trade's kind of going to suck during this time period. And because we're dealing with some money issues and some stability issues, other countries are going to start messing with us. They're not going to declare war against us, but they're going to be annoying, so to speak. Great Britain, when they signed that peace treaty with us in 1783, they agreed to move all their troops out of this region into what is today Canada. The problem is, we don't really have a good way to enforce that. We don't have a good way to like make them move their troops. So they kind of just don't. They just hang out. They hang out in the Great Lakes territory. They hang out in like modern day Massachusetts, Wisconsin, or not Massachusetts, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, you name it, right? Like they're just kind of hanging out. They're just kind of vibing in that region. And that's a problem for us because that's an enemy or a soldier or an army that's not ours in our country. And today, we call that an invasion. That is a declaration of war. Now, obviously, we just went to war with the British. We can't afford to do it again. So this is more of an annoyance than anything else, but it shows that Britain doesn't respect us as a nation. Something else that's going to happen is Spain is going to close the port of New Orleans. New Orleans, if you remember, is that massive city in Louisiana. It's that massive city at the bottom of the Mississippi River. If we can't ship things through the port of New Orleans, we can't easily trade goods in our northwestern territory. And if we can't easily trade goods, things become more expensive, trade becomes harder, and it either doesn't happen or takes longer, and either of those options are not great for us. So not only do we have internal difficulties with taxes and money and all that, we also have other countries messing with us and taking advantage of us because they can. That leads us to this knowledge check. Why is trade between the states so difficult? What's happening to make trade hard? All right, let's talk about getting new states. So, like we've mentioned, there's 13 states, right? There's the original 13 colonies. Those are the original 13 states. It's what we got the stripes on our flag for, right? By 1785, we decide that we want to do something with this land out west. We have land past the 13 states and original 13 colonies that is just kind of hanging out. There's no real government there. There's not a lot of people there. We want to get that land settled so we can make our nation larger and more powerful. So by 1785, we're going to set up the land ordinance. Now, this land ordinance is designed to create a system in which people can come out here to the west and they can settle and start setting up their new lives out here. So what they did is they sent out surveyors, people who look at the land, figure out where things are, make maps, etc. And they're going to survey this land and divide it into what are called townships. Now, these townships are 36 square mile sections. You can see in this image in the top right. Every section is a literal square. That's why if you go on like Google Maps or Apple Maps and turn on satellite view and you just hover over what we call the Midwest today, you'll notice a lot of squares, a lot of square plots, a lot of rectangles, you name it, right? It gets very straight lines. That's not normal. Like, people don't normally settle in squares. The reason they settled in squares is because we set up the whole township system, which is we set things up in squares because squares are easy to divide and sell and make lines on. Now, in like natural development, everything is sort of, follows the river, follows the geography. It just happens kind of randomly or pseudo randomly. But with the land ordinance, we're setting it up in this weird square system. Now, there are squares within squares within squares in this section. So I'm going to use this image you see in the top right as an example. One section is 640 acres, and those 640 acres sell for $640. $1 per acre. Makes sense. Easy, right? And then within those sections, within that 36 square mile section, you have 36 sections. So it's a 6x6 grid. And then within each of those grids, like you can see here, they've expanded section 26. There are subsections. So if you don't want to pay for all of section 26, you could buy half of 26, or a quarter of 26, or a half quarter of 26, or a quarter of 26, right? It depends on how much money you have, right? So a quarter section, that D&E section, so that is a quarter of a section, that is 40 acres. That would cost you $40. Now, if you wanted to buy all of 26, that would be 640 acres, $640. So it really depends on the amount of money you have and what you can afford and the land that you actually need. That's why they're breaking it down so much. Also, one thing I want to mention too, not every section was available for sale. What I mean by that is certain things were reserved. So you'll notice on this image it says section 16 Well, this section is reserved for public schools. Now, why would they choose Section 16? Why not 1 or 27 or 35? Well, they choose 16 because it's in the middle, and they want everyone to have a relatively quick commute to school, right? 16 is in the middle, which means everyone kind of, for the most part, has an even walk to school or ride to school or journey to school. Because when we do start setting up our public school system, we want to make sure everyone has access to a local place where they can become educated. Now, also, schools are not the only public building or place where public buildings have reserved land. There's also obviously going to be reserved land for a main town. There's going to be one for a post office. There's going to be one for government buildings. But the one that is always given the same spot are schools, which kind of leads to an interesting situation, because if you look at a map of schools in the Midwest, it looks like a grid. It looks like they're all kind of matched up and they're equidistant from each other, because most of them are still on Section 16 today. If you've been there for 200 years, what's the point of moving? So a lot of the schools are going to end up staying in this section over time. Now, some of them will expand, some of them will relocate, some will close, and new ones will open. But for the most part, a lot of schools are still in the same place they were 200 plus years ago. Now, what's the point? Why is the federal government doing this? We've already talked about how the purpose of this is we want to get people out here to settle this land so that, we can become more powerful. But this is also a money-making scheme. This is a money-making system. The government needs to make money. Now, today, the government will make money just by taxes, right? But like we've already talked about, there is no easy way to get the states to pay taxes to the federal government. So what the federal government does is they're going to sell this land to make money for the government. The idea is those $640, you're not paying this to some dude. You're paying this to the government, and the government is giving you the land. So the government is going to sell the land out here in the Midwest, in the Northwest Territory, and they're going to use that to help fund our military. They're going to use it to help fund our, what else? Oh, our Congress, obviously. They're going to use it to fund all the essential government services, post offices, health services, you name it. All the things that we would have paid for and had back then as part of our government, paid for by this land ordinance. Now, after the land ordinance, we're going to pass the Northwest Ordinance. Now, the Northwest Ordinance is about setting up a government. So the land ordinance is part one. Land ordinance is just, hey, let's get people out there, let's sell them land, let's get them settled. The Northwest Ordinance is part two. Okay, now that you're settled, let's set up your government. Let's set up your town, your city, your county, and eventually your states. So 1787, 2 years after the land starts to get sold, we start setting up a system to create a government. Now, these governments would have to guarantee basic rights for settlers, and in most cases, they will outlaw slavery. Now, this is specifically for the Northwest Territory. That would be modern-day Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. These 5 states were always free states, meaning they did not allow slavery. Not every state, as we move west, is going to become a free state. Some of them will become slave states, and some of them will get the choice to choose one or the other later on. It's a thing called popular sovereignty that we're going to get to in Unit 4. Now, the big rule here is we needed enough people before we could actually make them a state. So these new territories, they were allowed to become states once they reached a population of 60,000 free settlers. And this is sort of going to be the rule of thumb going forward, not just for the Northwest Territory. You have to have a certain number of people in your states before your state can become a state. That's part of the reason why it took Alaska, for example, so long to become a state. Why it became a state decades after everyone else, with the exception of Hawaii, was because there's just not a lot of people there. Now, there are obviously more than 60,000 people in Alaska today, but it took them much longer because, think about it, Alaska is probably not as fun of a place to live as California or Florida or Colorado or somewhere else where you're more connected to everyone else, where the weather's probably better most of the year, or at least a good chunk of the year. Like I mentioned earlier, these 5 states, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, are the 5 states created using the Northwest Ordinance and the Land Ordinance. As you can see from the image, some of these states will take shorter amounts of time to settle. Some of them will take longer. Ohio is the first one, 1803, simply because it's closer. You know, what's the point of traveling all the way to this upper left portion of Wisconsin when you can just go from Pennsylvania to Ohio and you're good to go, right? The roads are going to be closer, the people are going to be closer, you're going to have more access to services and things like that if you settle in the closer region. So Ohio is going to be the first one, 1803, and then it's going to take all the way to 1848 for Wisconsin, simply because it's further away. That leads us to our next knowledge check. What's the purpose of the Northwest Ordinance? Why does it exist? Now, we're going to go back to money. We're going to go back to economic problems. Kind of the big theme with the Articles of Confederation, if you haven't figured it out already, is we're bad at money. We're bad at raising money and keeping money, right? We've got our inability to force people to pay taxes, and we have our land selling scheme, right? The Northwest and Land Ordinances. Now, these ordinances are going to make some money, but it's not going to be enough. And because it's not enough, we're going to see an economic depression. Now, this economic depression, basically a depression, what it means is, in economic terms, what it means is when the economy is getting depressed or pushed down or slowed or it's being made smaller. So an economic depression, kind of like an economic recession, is when the government does not have the ability to keep the economy growing or functioning at the same rates. So during an economic depression like the Great Depression, or when COVID hit, we entered a recession, which is kind of like a depression, but not as bad. Things will get more expensive, money won't be as valuable, and generally speaking, things just get harder for people. And this economic depression in the 1780s is going to hit farmers the hardest. It's going to affect their lives the most. And here's why. During the war, we need to do all the normal things we do, and we need to fund and feed and clothe and produce things for a giant military, which means more farm products. So if you're a farmer during the Revolutionary War, you're not just making corn or whatever for people. You're making it for the people and you're making it for the army, which is great, right? Like you're going to see more profits during this time period because you have to make more stuff. Now, because you're making more stuff and you want to keep making more stuff, you're probably going to want more land or more seeds or more animals or more tools or you name it, more of whatever lets you make more farm goods or more goods to sell to make more money. Now, if you can't afford that, you might take out a loan. And you might take out a loan hoping to be able to pay it with the profits from this expanded agricultural production. The problem is that only works when there is a higher demand, when we need to have more food. But when the war is over and all those soldiers go back to their homes, you are no longer needing to produce food for both the army and the people. It's now just the people. But all those loans you took out as a farmer, you still have to pay those off, and you're no longer making the extra money. So because you now have this loan that's really expensive, and you're not selling as much as you used to, or you might have extra supplies you don't need, which are just going to go to waste, you're not able to pay back your loan. And if you know anything about banking, you know that if you can't pay back your loan, the person who owns the loan, the person who gave you that money, needs something of value in return. Let's use houses for an example. If you cannot pay your home loan to the bank, what the bank is going to do is they're going to repossess your house, because that is how they're going to get their money back. And obviously, you don't want to lose your house, so you're going to want to pay your loan. These farmers, they might lose their farms. They might lose their animals. They might lose their tools. They might lose everything because they are not able to pay back their loans. And this is going to be incredibly difficult for them. And because this is incredibly difficult for them, they're going to start being very angry with the governments. A little bit ironic. We just fought a war to get rid of a bad government, and now we're sitting in a situation where some people still feel that we have a bad government. And this is where Daniel Shays comes in. Daniel Shays is a veteran of the Revolutionary War. He fought at Bunker Hill, and he fought at Saratoga. And in 1786, he's a farmer. And he is experiencing all those difficulties we just talked about. And so when Massachusetts is going to raise its taxes, and they are going to make things more difficult for people, those people are not able to pay their taxes. But Massachusetts still needs money somehow. Remember, this is a state government. States can levy taxes, states can make you pay taxes, but the federal government cannot. So Massachusetts here is making people pay their taxes. Unfortunately, if you cannot pay your taxes, Massachusetts will just take your farm instead. And if Massachusetts takes your farm, you can't make a living, you might starve, you've got a family to look out for. That's horrible, right? So what happens is Daniel Shays and over 1,000 other farmers in Massachusetts are going to rise up in rebellion against Massachusetts. They're going to attack courthouses. Now, these courthouses are obviously, the reason they're attacking courthouses is because the courthouses are where judges are going to sign orders to take these farms. So they're trying to get rid of the records. They're trying to stop this from happening. And they're also going to raid tax agencies. Basically, they're terrorizing the people who would punish them, or the people who would take their stuff. They're not rising up against innocent people. They're not killing innocent people. All they're doing is expressing their frustration and taking out their anger on the organizations and institutions that would hurt them directly. And once they engage in this tiny rebellion, the Massachusetts militia is going to be called up. Those Minutemen, the men who fought in the Revolutionary War, their job is to drive off Shays' rebellion. And they're marginally successful, like they are kind of able to drive off the rebellion, but it's very, very difficult. It takes a very long time. It's very costly, and people are not satisfied with how long it took and the fact that this happened in the first place. And because people are unsatisfied, they see Shays' rebellion and they go, that's a bad situation. We can't let this happen. And that's where we start to get calls for revision. People start realizing maybe the Articles of Confederation are too weak. We like that they're weak, or at least weaker than the king. We like strong state governments. But the fact that Shays and all these farmers can just rise up and this becomes a massive problem, that shows us something's broken here. So by May of 1787, a bunch of different leaders from a bunch of the states, they meet in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and they decide, okay, the Articles are currently broken. Let's fix them. But here's the thing. These people are sent here to fix the Articles of Confederation. But when they get there and they start discussing, they realize the Articles are broken beyond repair. The Articles of Confederation will never actually work. And because they will never actually work, they decide to completely throw them out and start from scratch. And that Constitution that they create in the summer of 1787 is the same Constitution we have today. So the Articles of Confederation only stick around for about 10 or so years until they are shown to be broken by Daniel Shays, and we decide to replace them with something better. And that leads us to our final knowledge check for this section. What is the point of Shays' Rebellion? What does it show us? Why is it important in American history?